September 11, 2001, American Airlines Flight 77 climbs into a crystal-clear morning sky, a routine departure cloaked in calm. Within 8 minutes, the cockpit is overtaken, radio silence, then a chilling absence from radar screens. Controllers struggle to track a vanished jet as it circles invisibly toward the Pentagon, the heart of U.S. military command. 64 souls aboard, 125 more inside the fortress. No warning, no interception, just a catastrophic breach of the world's most secure airspace. How did a commercial flight become the weapon that struck the heart of American power? The answers unravel where Flight 77's trail disappears into a gap that changed history forever. At Gate D26, passengers queued for American Airlines Flight 77, greeted by the everyday rhythm of an early morning at Dulles. The crew, led by Captain Charles Burlingame, a former Navy fighter pilot, checked instruments and coordinated with ground staff. In first class, 5 men moved with quiet intent. Hani Hanjour, the only one with flight training, had chosen a seat near the cockpit. Security video later showed 2 of his companions setting off metal detectors. Handheld wands swept their bodies, but nothing was found that could stop them. Under the rules that morning, box cutters and small knives were not forbidden. 3 hijackers were flagged by the airline's screening system, but the process focused on checked baggage, not on scrutinizing carry-ons or searching people more thoroughly. The 8:20 a.m. departure slipped into the sky with 64 people on board. Cabin crew offered coffee, passengers settled in, and the aircraft climbed west toward Los Angeles. At 8:46, Flight 77 reached its cruising altitude. 9 minutes later, a final routine radio call, acknowledged by Captain Burlingame, nothing unusual. Then, just before 9 o'clock, the comm broke. The hijackers made their move. In the narrow aisle, knives flashed and the cockpit door was forced open. Passengers and crew were forced to the back. No Mayday call went out, no alert code was punched in. Within 8 minutes from the last friendly radio voice, command of the aircraft had changed hands. Hani Hanjour now sat at the controls. The rest of the cockpit crew was out of sight, their fate unknown. The Boeing 757, still following its assigned path, was now in the grip of attackers who moved with cold precision. As the cockpit door shut for the last time, the world outside flew on, unaware that Flight 77 was no longer in the hands of its crew. 8 minutes, the gap between the ordinary and the unthinkable. At 8:56 a.m., Flight 77 vanished from the air traffic control screens. The transponder, the device that broadcasts an aircraft's identity and altitude, went silent. For controllers in Indianapolis Center, the familiar tagged blip simply faded into the clutter of anonymous radar echoes. No electronic signature, no radio replies, and no sign of distress. Standard protocol called for search and rescue procedures. Controllers speculated about a crash, dispatching emergency teams to scour the last known position over West Virginia. But the Boeing 757 was still in the sky, veering east, now a shadow crossing the system undetected. The missing transponder data exposed the gaps in the surveillance network. Primary radar, which tracks objects by bounced radio waves instead of electronic pings, still saw something moving across the screen, but its information was crude. No flight number, no altitude, just a streak heading toward the nation's capital. For more than 8 minutes, the software filtered out this ghostly trace, failing to alert anyone that the flight continued. Inside the FAA's command centers, calls began to echo between regions. At 9:18 a.m., Kerry Johnson, operations supervisor at Washington Center, phoned his counterpart in Indianapolis. He described a ghost over Indiana, a track with no name, no flight plan, floating in the system. John Thomas at Indianapolis replied that Flight 77 was lost, but maybe turning. The conversation underscored a deeper problem. The system relied on cooperation and technology not built for an enemy disabling the rules. As the minutes passed, confusion mounted. NORAD, the military's watch on the skies, remained in the dark. Their radar screen showed hundreds of returns, but none clearly marked as a threat. FAA field facilities and American Airlines tried to piece together the puzzle, some searching west, others scanning east. In this silence, Flight 77 arced through the air, unseen and unchallenged, flying toward its target while the defense network struggled with blind spots and uncertainty. At 9:32 a.m., controllers at Dulles picked up an unidentified radar target hurtling east at extraordinary speed. The blip barreled toward the heart of Washington, closing fast. Seconds later, air traffic control at Reagan National radioed a Minnesota Air National Guard C-130, call sign Gopher 06, recently airborne from Andrews. Lieutenant Colonel Stephen O'Brien at the controls scanned the sky and caught sight of a silver jet with American Airlines stripes, down low, moving fast and erratic. O'Brien confirmed the sighting, a Boeing 757 flying much lower than commercial traffic ever should over the capital. Flight 77 had dropped from the sky at more than 500 miles per hour. As it swept from the west, it clipped the tops of 5 highway light poles along Route 27, shearing metal as if it were nothing, scattering debris and sparks across lanes filled with rush-hour traffic. Cars screeched to a halt as drivers saw an airliner dive past, wingtips nearly brushing the ground. Less than 2 seconds later, the jet's landing gear retracted, the nose pitched slightly upward, and the right wing lifted just before impact. At 9:37 and 46 seconds a.m., the aircraft slammed into the Pentagon's western facade at the first-floor level. The force at 530 miles per hour compressed the plane into fragments, punching through 3 solid rings of the building. Jet fuel erupted into a fireball roaring out from the point of impact, engulfing offices and corridors. The shockwave shattered windows far from the strike zone, sending waves of glass and concrete across workspaces densely packed with military and civilian staff. Overhead, O'Brien saw the plume of flame burst upward from the structure and radioed in, "Looks like that aircraft crashed into the Pentagon, sir. There was no warning, no interception." The only military aircraft anywhere close was the C-130, too high and too far behind to intervene, left to circle and report. On the ground, reinforced columns and blast-resistant windows, installed after earlier renovations, bought precious minutes before outer walls crumbled, but could not stop the devastation inside. For the first time in history, the U.S. military's nerve center had been struck by a commercial jet, and the nation's most secure building stood burning, its defense breached from the sky. The crash at the Pentagon claimed 184 lives. 64 people aboard American Airlines Flight 77 were killed instantly, 5 crew members, 58 passengers, and the 5 hijackers. Within the Pentagon, 125 military and civilian employees lost their lives at their desks, in conference rooms, or walking the corridors. Most had no warning. Among the passengers, Captain Charles Burlingame brought a unique history to his final flight. A graduate of the Naval Academy, he once flew F-4 Phantoms for the Navy and had worked in the Pentagon's own corridors during his years in uniform. After retiring from the reserves, he joined American Airlines. That morning, he signed on for a routine transcontinental run, not knowing he would be piloting a flight that would strike his former workplace. Barbara Olson, a lawyer and television commentator, was heading to Los Angeles to appear on a news program. When the hijackers took control, she managed to phone her husband, Ted Olson, the United States Solicitor General, from the rear of the plane. She calmly described the situation, reporting that passengers had been herded together while the hijackers brandished knives and box cutters. Her calls to Ted, cut short by static and fear, became some of the only glimpses into what happened in those final minutes on board. 3 school children and their teachers boarded Flight 77 for a National Geographic expedition, a field trip that promised adventure, not disaster. Dozens of other passengers were traveling for work, family, or routine business. Each person carried their own story, abruptly ended in the smoke and fire. Inside the Pentagon, the victims represented every branch of the military and included secretaries, accountants, and high-ranking officers. Many were just settling in for another workday. The halls that withstood so many wars now became a place of loss for families across the country. Portraits line the Pentagon Memorial, each name a reminder of a life cut short. The attack's impact would ripples through every community touched by those aboard Flight 77 and those inside the walls of the nation's defense. The aftermath of the Pentagon attack triggered an urgent transformation across America's airports. In November 2001, a new federal agency took charge, the Transportation Security Administration. For the first time, airport security screening no longer relied on private contractors, but became a direct federal responsibility. Walk-through metal detectors and X-ray scanners were recalibrated and backed by stricter protocols. The list of prohibited items expanded overnight, closing loopholes that hijackers had exploited. Airlines installed hardened cockpit doors by mandate, crafted to withstand sustained force and block unauthorized entry. The Federal Air Marshal Service grew from a limited presence to a national program, putting armed officers on a much wider range of flights. Behind the scenes, the Department of Homeland Security began integrating intelligence, threat assessments, and operational command for aviation security. In the months that followed, travelers faced longer lines and new rules, but the goal was unmistakable: ensuring that a commercial jetliner could never again be weaponized so easily over American soil. Aviation security reforms launched in the U.S. soon rippled across borders. Within months, airports from London to Tokyo began upgrading screening measures, adding advanced metal detectors and explosive trace devices at checkpoints. The International Civil Aviation Organization coordinated a wave of regulatory changes, urging nations to harden cockpit doors, tighten access control, and standardize no-fly and watchlist procedures. Intelligence sharing pacts expanded, linking agencies that once guarded information behind national walls. The European Union, Canada, and Australia adopted protocols that mirrored new American standards, from random baggage screening to biometric identification systems for travelers. The reach of the Patriot Act also spurred broader data sharing among allied intelligence services, closing gaps that had allowed threats to move undetected between countries. By 2002, over 180 countries reported compliance with new ICAO directives, setting a new baseline for global aviation security. Travelers soon faced similar rules, whether boarding in Frankfurt, Dubai, or Sydney, a sign that vulnerability in one system meant risk everywhere. At 9:37 a.m. on September 11, 2001, American Airlines Flight 77 struck the Pentagon at 530 miles per hour, claiming 189 lives and exposing critical vulnerabilities in U.S. aviation security. Official records confirm the hijackers took control in just 8 minutes, disabled the transponder, and vanished from secondary radar, leaving air traffic controllers and military officials struggling to track the threat. The cockpit voice recorder was too damaged to yield audio, and some operational details remain classified in government archives. Yet the impact of this attack led to sweeping reforms: the creation of the Transportation Security Administration, reinforced cockpit doors, expanded air marshal programs, and new global screening standards. Still, families and investigators press for answers about remaining gaps and response delays. Today, every checkpoint, secure cockpit, and restricted airspace traces back to lessons written in the aftermath of Flight 77. The Pentagon Memorial stands as a permanent reminder of one flight, one symbol, and one warning etched in American history.